Welcome to this presentation, Transforming the Response to Domestic Abuse in Later Life. This training has been produced using data from national datasets, research from the longitudinal study Doors Choice, and a research report, Understanding the Experiences and Response to Older Victims of Domestic Abuse in Oldham, which was commissioned by Oldham Safeguarding Adults Board. The aims of the training are to enable practitioners to understand the prevalence of domestic abuse in later life, identify the range of relationship dynamics where an older person can be a victim of domestic abuse, identify the nature and signs of domestic abuse in later life, understand barriers to help seeking for older victim survivors of domestic abuse, and understand when and where to refer older victim survivors for multi-agency support. Doors Choice is a research initiative based at the Centre for Age, Gender and Social Justice, established in 2015. The initiative uniquely combines a longitudinal research study with a co-produced specialist support service for older female, male and non-binary victim survivors of domestic abuse, experiencing domestic abuse from intimate partners and adult family members. To date, the Doors Choice initiative has provided intensive support for over 180 older people and their family members. In England and Wales, the Domestic Abuse Act of 2021 defines domestic abuse as a single incident or course of conduct between those who are aged 16 years or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members. Domestic abuse consists of physical or sexual abuse, violent or threatening behaviour, controlling or coercive behaviour, economic, psychological, emotional or other abuse. Some things to consider that are often missed. Firstly, the pattern of incidents. Domestic abuse rarely consists of a one-off incident. Instead, it often occurs as a pattern of one or more forms of abuse, often involving coercive or controlling behaviour. The data evidences that domestic abuse victims are more likely to become repeat victims than with any other crime, with violence fluctuating or escalating over time. Secondly, abuse can be committed both by current and also ex-partners. Many victim survivors experience post-separation violence. Leaving or attempting to leave the relationship has been identified as one of the most dangerous points for a victim. Domestic homicide reviews evidence a strong link between separation and homicide, with domestic homicide likely to occur within 3 months of the individual leaving or attempting to leave the relationship. Victims aged over 60 years are more likely to experience abuse from a current partner than younger victims. 40% of victims aged over 60 as compared to 28% of victims who are under 60. Thirdly, domestic abuse can also be committed by a range of adult family members. The prevalence of adult family violence towards victims increases with age. 44% of victims aged over 60 years will experience abuse from adult family members as compared to 6% of victims who are under 60. Typically, the response to victims of domestic abuse, including policy, service provision and current risk assessment models, is focused on an intimate partner model. The response has been developed from research primarily based on the experiences of younger victims, mainly women and children, experiencing abuse from a male intimate partner and ex-partners. This is often known as the public story of domestic abuse. The public story of domestic abuse also influences public perceptions of what domestic abuse is and who it affects. When we talk about domestic abuse, we are largely informed by who we see in service provision and the media. The images on the slide were taken from recent domestic abuse awareness campaigns. Looking at the images, which groups of victims are not immediately obvious? Older people, aged 55 years and over, male victims, LGBTQ+ people, people with disabilities, people experiencing abuse by adult family members. The public story creates barriers to groups of victims recognising themselves and their experiences as domestic abuse. and also for professionals and the wider society in identifying the signs of abuse. Doers' Choice research on domestic abuse in later life found that older victims experienced systemic ageism, and little was known about their experiences of domestic abuse. This slide looks at that in a little more detail. There were significant gaps in data collection. Until 2017, the Crime Survey for England and Wales only collected domestic abuse data for victims aged 16 to 59 years. The age cap was raised to 74 years in 2017. 280,000 people aged 60 to 74 years of age experienced domestic abuse in the year ending 2020. The upper age cap has now been removed, though it should be noted that domestic abuse data was not collected by the survey during COVID-19. A large number of Doers' Choice referrals have been for individuals aged 75 to 85 years, so they wouldn't have been captured in previous surveys. Significant gaps in research. There is limited research on older people and their experiences of domestic abuse, and the abuse was often framed under the umbrella term of elder abuse, alongside abuse from non-family members and institutional abuse. This also had the effect of homogenising older people, who are a diverse group with an age span of over 40 years, different lived experiences and needs. Gaps in service provision. Domestic abuse assessment tools and service responses have been developed based on the available research and demographic data collected on younger victims of intimate partner abuse and their children, and do not adequately reflect older people's experiences of domestic abuse from intimate partners or family members. For example, the Domestic Abuse, Stalking and Honour-Based Violence Assessment Tool, or DASH, was designed solely on research on younger females of intimate partner violence only, not adult family violence. The lack of research and data collection has led to there being no evidence base to inform needs assessments or commissioning of services. And lastly, a lack of understanding about older victim survivor lived experiences of domestic abuse. There has been a lack of visibility and recognition of older people as victim survivors of domestic abuse within service provision and the media. For example, Safe Lives Insight data in 2016 found only 3% of older victims accessed IDVA services supported by the MARAC model. There's a lack of understanding of older people as victims of abuse from adult family members, again framed as elder abuse, although this does fall within the definition of domestic abuse. We know domestic abuse will affect approximately 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men in their lifetime. Domestic abuse has more repeat victims than any other crime, and on average there will have been 35 assaults before a victim calls the police. On average, police in England and Wales receive over 100 calls relating to domestic abuse every hour, yet it's significantly underreported, and it is estimated only 18% of women who experienced domestic abuse in 2018 reported to police. Given the gaps in data, what do we know about the prevalence of domestic abuse amongst older adults? Older people account for a large proportion of the population. At the 2011 census, over 22% of the population of England and Wales were aged 60 and over. Figures from the Crime Survey for England and Wales show, in the year ending March 2020, 5.5% of adults aged 16 to 74 years of age, which accounts for 2.3 million adults, experienced domestic abuse. 280,000 were aged 60 to 74 years. Domestic abuse is experienced by 14.75% of women with a disability and 7.5% of men with a disability, compared with 6% of women and 3.2% of men without a disability. So you are more than twice as likely to experience domestic abuse if you have a disability. It is estimated 40% of people aged 60 years and over have a disability that affects their daily life. In England and Wales, there were 362 domestic homicides in the 2 years combined period of March 2018 to March 2020, and of those, 260 were killed by a partner or ex-partner, and 97 were killed by an adult family member. Current data shows 27% of domestic homicides in England and Wales involve a victim aged 60 and over. Between the year ending March 2018 and the year ending 2020, the highest proportion of domestic homicide victims per head of population were aged 70 years and over, accounting for 18% of all victims. Focusing on Greater Manchester and Oldham, in the year ending March 2020, Greater Manchester Police recorded 50,748 domestic abuse-related crimes. 3,407 of those were in Oldham. In the same year, Greater Manchester Police recorded just over 39,000 crimes as domestic abuse-related violence against the person, and 1,104 crimes of coercive or controlling behaviour. A survey of older victims' experiences in Oldham reported 23% of respondents had experienced having a weapon used against them. 23% had experienced injuries requiring medical care. In terms of local authority adult safeguarding in Oldham 2020 to 21, it is estimated that 1,660 adults aged 60 and over experienced domestic abuse each year in Oldham. In the year 2020 to 21, 2,040 safeguarding concerns were raised. Only 64 of these were domestic abuse-related concerns for people over the age of 55. The number gets smaller when we look at concerns that proceeded to Section 42 inquiries. Only 20 concluded inquiries were identified as domestic abuse. There is an assumption that the majority of older victims of domestic abuse receive an adult safeguarding response. The data shows that very small numbers of domestic abuse safeguarding concerns will be raised for older victims, and only a small number of older victims will be eligible for a statutory response. So to recap, older people account for an estimated 22% of the population. 27% of domestic homicides in England and Wales involve a victim aged 60 or over. There is limited data on older victims to inform needs assessments and commissioning of services. Older victims have low visibility in domestic abuse provision. Domestic abuse tools are not designed to capture the experiences of older victims of intimate partner violence or adult family abuse. And older victims of domestic abuse have low visibility in statutory safeguarding adult responses, and many will not be eligible for a statutory response. Older people can be victims of domestic abuse in a broad range of relationships that meet the definition of domestic abuse, but are often not identified. In long-term relationships where domestic abuse has always been a feature, the abuse may have fluctuated. For example, it may have been physical early on and then become controlling in nature over the longer term, but it has always been present. The abuse may have become normalised for the victim. The abuse may also be normalised to family, friends and practitioners because it's viewed as a long-term feature of the relationship and unlikely to change. Options to seek help, leave, are rarely explored with the victim. Abuse can also escalate or change with age. This can be due to significant life changes. For example, if the perpetrator or victim retire and then they start spending more time together, changing health or care needs of the victim or perpetrator, loss of friends or family members who provided a protective factor. We know that when perpetrators sense a loss of control, the abusive behaviour often increases. This is demonstrated in domestic homicide reviews that have found high numbers of older perpetrators were in a caring role for their partner. At points of escalation, victims are often aware of their increased risk and more likely to disclose, which highlights the importance of asking older people about abuse. Increasingly, people are forming new relationships in later life. New relationships can involve selling houses, pooling financial assets and moving away from family and friends. Leaving a new relationship in later life can be more complex for an older victim, as they have less opportunity to start again, particularly financially, and limited options of returning to family. Victims engaging with Doris Choice have reported experiencing increased violence and abuse when they have been forced to remain living with the perpetrator while seeking a divorce. In same-sex relationships, older lesbian, gay, bisexual and transsexual people experience domestic abuse at least at the same level in their intimate relationships as heterosexual people, with research suggesting the rates could be significantly higher. Despite this, their visibility in services is extremely low. There is a misconception that sexuality is not very important in later life, and questions about sexual orientation and gender identity are rarely asked. Assumptions that an older person is heterosexual can present a barrier to disclosure. Older LGBTQ+ people can be subject to additional unique forms of abuse aimed at sexuality or gender, including threats to out them and reinforcing myths that they won't be believed. Intimate partner relationships, where there has been a change in behaviour due to illnesses affecting the brain, are also to be considered. In a previously healthy relationship, harmful behaviour can be a direct consequence of diseases affecting the brain, the most common being dementia. Although most people with dementia are not aggressive, many may lash out of fear, and some types of dementia can cause personality changes and loss of sexual inhibitions. It's important to identify if there was a history of abuse prior to the onset of dementia, or if it's a new feature. A victim with dementia can also experience an escalation of abuse, which can signify a marked increase in risk. Adult family relationships. The older person may be living in the home of the adult child, or the adult child or grandchild may be living in the older person's home, or they may be visiting regularly. Research highlights high prevalence of substance misuse and dependency in adult child perpetrators, and the older person may be providing support with substance misuse, poor mental health and/or financial difficulties. Domestic homicides reviews reflect that when the perpetrator is an adult child, often the older person is providing some form of care for them. It's increasingly common for older people to take a parental role for grandchildren who are estranged from their parents and continue to support in adult life. Although less common, abuse can also be perpetrated by other family members, including older parents and siblings. Abuse can involve multiple family members, either simultaneously or concurrently. For older LGBTQ+ people, abuse could involve families of choice, though this falls outside of the definition of domestic abuse. In later life, there is an increase in the prevalence of male victims. The Access to Justice study sample group consisted of 73% female and 27% male victims, with the percentage of male victims rising when they were over 80 years of age and then again at 85. There is an added complexity in relationships where there are care dynamics. There can be a misconception that risk reduces with age, but limited data available suggests that older people are as likely to experience the same range of severity of abuse and the same types of domestic abuse as younger victims, as seen on this slide. Abuse may be harder to identify and can be disguised by natural signs of ageing, declining health, decreasing mobility, questions over mental capacity, and care dynamics. The next few slides break these down into more detail. Emotional abuse includes verbally abusing someone by saying things that undermine the person's confidence and self-esteem. It's often directed at a person's appearance or ability to carry out tasks. For an older person, emotional and psychological abuse can be directly targeted at their age and designed to humiliate by suggesting they lack capacity, are a burden, or are no longer of any use. Emotional abuse can be used to further exert control by making an older person doubt their own capability or capacity to carry out actions or make decisions for themselves. Emotional abuse can have long-lasting psychological impact, including depression, anxiety, and poor self-esteem. In an intimate relationship, a victim may have been subjected to gaslighting behaviour over a long period of time. For example, falsely telling the victim they've forgotten information and tasks, or reframing events. Gaslighting can significantly impact on an individual's confidence in their ability to function in the world independently, which can create a barrier to leaving. Abuse by adult family members can include using parental obligation to shift blame and responsibility on the parent or grandparent for the adult child's or grandchild's life choices or circumstances. Emotional abuse can be combined with financial abuse to guilt the older person into supporting the family member financially. An older person who is seen to look to a partner or family member to answer for them in social situations may have been exposed to psychological and emotional abuse in the past, or by the person answering on their behalf, and have lost the confidence to engage socially. Most of the knowledge around coercive or controlling behaviour is based on research into younger heterosexual intimate relationships. However, Doris Joyce research strongly evidences that coercive control is often a feature in older people's experiences of abuse from both intimate partners and adult family members. An older person may have experienced coercive control for decades in an intimate relationship, significantly influencing their sense of self-identity and confidence in their ability to make decisions for themselves. As a result, the older victim can feel de-skilled and lack confidence to function independently in the modern world, which can present a significant barrier to leaving. For older victim survivors in heterosexual relationships, coercive control can be masked by historic gender norms of relationships, with men positioned as head of the household, with control over finances and decision-making. For same-sex relationships, an older victim may not have had a public model for what a healthy same-sex relationship looked like, and be vulnerable to manipulation by a more experienced partner. Age-related factors such as health conditions, disability, care needs, and low levels of social contact can be manipulated by an abusive partner or family member to increase control and dependency, including constantly criticising, humiliation, abuse related to faith, controlling, monitoring or restricting daily activities, controlling, hindering access to independent communication, preventing a victim from learning a language or making friends outside of the ethnic cultural background, preventing access to services and support, using threats to pets to coerce and control, and isolating. Coercive or controlling behaviour is an offence under Section 76 of the Serious Crime Act of 2015, and the Domestic Abuse Act amended Section 76 to include ex-partners and family members who do not live with the victim, which will come into force late 2022. This has been particularly significant for older victims experiencing abuse from family members who are visiting the home regularly but not living with the victim. Economic abuse is included in the new definition of domestic abuse in the Domestic Abuse Act. Financial and economic abuse can include direct theft or theft by using a person's identity to borrow money, run up debts, or buy goods without the older person's permission. An older person can also experience a range of financially and economically abusive behaviours from a partner or family member, including controlling the person's finances and denying them access to their own money and financial information, for example through digital banking. Using emotional abuse or threats of violence to persuade an older person to hand over their money. This may be viewed as the older person consenting to giving money. Borrow money and not giving it back. Exaggerating the older person's care needs to access increased benefits. Going shopping for the older person and buying shopping for themselves with the older person's money without their permission. Drawing out more cash than they were asked to and pocketing the extra. Restricting an older person's available income by giving them an allowance or pocket money, or misuse of financial power of attorney. Additionally, an older person may experience pressure to sign over property and financial assets, or pressure to change or make a will, or appoint a power of attorney. Physical abuse can involve more obvious behaviours such as hitting, pushing, kicking. Older victims may also sustain additional injuries caused by perpetrator behaviour that they may not recognise themselves as abuse and that are harder for practitioners to identify. For example, being pushed or falling while attempting to avoid assault, causing injury or exacerbating existing conditions such as a hip or knee problem. Injuries caused by a hoarding behaviour or placing of obstructions by the perpetrator in the home. Injuries caused by refusal by the perpetrator to allow the fitting or use of mobility aids, for example grab rails or walking frames. Misuse of medication that is caused by incorrect dosage or administering unprescribed medication. Medication may also be withheld. Signs can present as poor care, but cause physical harm, such as poorly managed medical conditions, neglectful behaviour, including leaving someone in a room that's too cold, injuries caused by rough handling during delivering or receiving care, for example being grabbed or leant on, left in inappropriate or soiled clothing, refusal of perpetrator to seek medical assistance, leading to delay in medical treatment for a victim. Physical consequences of abuse should not be overlooked and attributed to age-related illness. It's important to discuss and explore the underlying causes of all injuries with older victims, including increased health needs and decreased mobility, which may be linked directly to abuse and/or increased vulnerability to serious injury. Older victims may present with long-standing health needs that may have been caused at an earlier point in their lives or through repeat injury. In police recorded crime data for sexual offences in the year ending March 2020, 2.4% of victims were aged 60 and over. Research has also highlighted gaps in knowledge around consent and criminality in the older age group. Marital rape did not become a criminal offence until 1991. For older people who experienced rape within a marriage before that date, this would not have been a crime unless they sustained a physical injury. A YouGov survey carried out in 2018 found that 35% of those surveyed aged 65 years and over did not think that non-consenting sex with a spouse or partner was rape. There are numerous initiatives aimed at younger people around healthy sexual relationships and consent, but very little targeted at older people. In a health context, the physical signs of recent sexual violence for an older person may be similar to a younger victim, as can be seen on the slide. However, physical signs of past incidents or repeated incidents of sexual violence can be missed in older victims, particularly older women, as they can be seen as normal signs of deteriorating health in later life. Contact with health providers across the life course can offer unique opportunities for disclosure of sexual violence, particularly for women. What are the barriers older victim survivors face when accessing and engaging with services? Older victims can face a range of barriers to disclosing abuse and seeking help and support. They can be individual or institutional and organisational. Individual barriers can include a fear of repercussion from the perpetrator if they disclose abuse, fear of repercussion from family and community. Past negative responses may have compounded fears of disclosure. Adult children are not always supportive of an older parent's decision to leave a relationship, and there can be a reluctance to report an adult child or grandchild over fears of criminalising them. Not recognising the behaviour as domestic abuse can create uncertainty over where and how to disclose the abuse and what services are available to support. The older victim may be dependent on the perpetrator, either financially or for care and support, and a lack of knowledge over rights and entitlements can reinforce this. An older victim may feel self-blame and shame for the abuse and be experiencing poor self-esteem and poor mental health, which can make their situation seem impossible to escape. Institutional barriers can include myths and stereotypes that the older person will not want to make changes or to leave a relationship. Doers' Choice research have found that when options are explained, combined with intensive support to exercise choice, older victims do often choose to leave an intimate relationship or take steps to remove an abusive adult family member from their home. Additionally, older perpetrators can present as frail to services, particularly if they are seen as having declining health or care and support needs. This can create a barrier for professionals, both in terms of underestimating the level of risk an older perpetrator poses and in taking action to sanction or remove an older perpetrator from the home. The lack of recognition of older people as victims of intimate partner and familial abuse, combined with a lack of specialist services and accessible housing, can present significant barriers. Oldham's report into older victims found that there had only been 3 referrals in the past year for older adults to refuge provision and no referrals for victims over the age of 65. Doers' Choice research has highlighted a lack of accessible emergency accommodation suitable for older victim survivors. Additionally, the lack of older persons accommodation that allow pets presents a barrier, as often the older victim will refuse to be parted from a much-loved pet who has been their only source of comfort. Practitioners engaging with Doers' Choice have reported concerns over asking older people about domestic abuse, particularly sexual abuse, due to fears that they will cause offence or embarrass the older person. Older victims engaging with Doers' Choice have repeatedly stated that, had they been asked about the abuse, they would have disclosed. In Oldham, survivors from minority ethnic communities highlighted a range of cultural barriers that impact on the reporting of abuse. Survivors talked about cultural pressures, language and literacy barriers to accessing services. Some required other family members to translate when dealing with services, which meant that they couldn't speak freely. Others talked about the fear of being shunned by their family or community. Others highlighted how unstable immigration status and a lack of recourse to public funds can be used as a screen to commit abuse. Enabling positive help seeking, Oldham survivors said they wanted to access support via services not branded as domestic abuse, so via community spaces, groups and activities. Attempt to create a safe space to have a conversation alone with the person. Reassure that disclosures are confidential. Allow the individual to disclose at their own pace. Revisit risk assessments. Ask again and keep asking. Check the person knows who to contact for help, and promote engagement with positive social ties. Practitioners can take simple steps to enable positive help seeking. And one of the key messages from older victim survivors engaging with Doers' Choice is, I wanted someone to ask me, and if they'd asked me, I would have told them. A practitioner may be the only person the individual has contact with other than the person who's causing them harm. Therefore, they may be the only person the older person can talk to about the abuse. It's important not to waste the opportunity to ask. And there are some simple steps practitioners can take to help an older person disclose abuse and seek help and support. Attempt to create a safe and private space to have a conversation alone with the older person. If you're visiting an older person or they're attending an appointment, try and create a space to talk to them on their own when your conversation will not be overheard. It may sound obvious, but it's common for older victims to attend appointments with family members or intimate partners. Older people have said that although they may be willing to share some details of the abuse in front of a family member, there are some details, particularly abuse of a sexual nature, that they will hold back. If you're having a conversation over the phone, be aware that your conversation with the person may not be private. Ask the older person if there's anyone else at home or in the room. Try to create a space to have a private conversation. If possible, find out if there is a time when they're alone. For example, does the person they're with go to the shop or attend appointments? Make sure to explain that what you are going to do with the information the older person tells you. Be open and honest that you cannot promise to keep a disclosure to yourself, but reassure that you will only share with designated people to increase safety and provide support. Reassure the older person that they can talk to you in confidence and that you will not share information with their friends and family. Allow the older person to disclose at their own pace. A person may not be ready to tell you that they are experiencing abuse, but over time, with established trust and rapport, they may feel in a position to further disclose. This is particularly important when assessing risk. Check the older person knows who to contact for help. Older people are often not aware of their rights and entitlements, and that they can call the police if they're afraid. They may be worried that they're wasting professionals' precious time, so reminding them of the roles of services and that that's what they're there to do can be really helpful. This is also an opportunity to raise awareness of services available to help and to challenge misconceptions about the roles of safeguarding and police. Consider how socially connected the older person is. Are they always accompanied by one person? Does that one person appear to do everything for them? Do they speak for them? If you call and a partner or family member assures you the person is fine, always ask to speak to the person themselves. Consider who can help the older person to become more socially connected. This will help reduce reliance on an abusive person and keep open avenues for disclosure. It can also help to disrupt abusive behaviours as the abusive person is aware someone else is watching. Positive social contacts can help with safety planning too. For example, a plan could be put in place for a concern to be raised if the older person misses their regular call with a designated person. And use language the older person is comfortable with. They may not recognise that what they are experiencing is abuse, and they may not be comfortable with the term. Be led by the language they are using to describe what's happening, and respond using descriptive language. For example, they may say, "She's a bully," and you can ask, "In what way does she bully you?" And here are some key tips for practitioners who are supporting older survivors of adult family violence. Be direct in addressing any self-blame that's experienced by the survivor and make it clear that the abuser is responsible for their behaviours. Challenge attempts by a victim to excuse abusive or controlling behaviours on the basis of the abuser's own support needs or vulnerabilities. Challenge suggestions that abusive behaviours are caused by bad parenting. Explore the victim's boundaries. Ask what level of behaviour they are prepared to accept before they take action. This can be a difficult conversation, but it helps the older victim to reflect, and it can be revisited if family members' behaviour goes beyond this point. For an example, the older person may not want to call the police if a family member takes a small amount of cash, but what would they do if they took their bank card without permission? If an older victim is reluctant to call police, explore whether they would be comfortable with another person doing so on their behalf. For example, a trusted neighbour, family member or friend. Discuss all housing and legal options with the older person without making assumptions about what they will want to do. If appropriate, involve other agencies to explore whether support is available for the abuser. Engaging the abuser with support, for example, alternative housing, may be the most effective way to safeguard the older victim. Carry out your own risk assessment and update when new disclosures are made. And revisit options. Often attitudes change when the older person has built trust with the support worker. They may start to reframe the abuse and feel more confident to take action. Trauma-informed practice is a strengths-based approach that recognises the impact that single and repeated experiences of trauma have on an individual's physical, emotional and psychological well-being, and how this affects both their response to the abuse and their response to accepting and engaging with support. There are some key skills practitioners can use when responding to trauma. Using a person-centred approach, which places the person at the centre of the service. Ensure you have an open and honest conversation with the older survivor about their mental health and well-being, including being mindful of expressions of suicidal ideation. Be aware of the possible impacts of trauma and how this may present in different people, particularly for an older survivor where it may be mistaken for diminished cognitive function. Showing understanding. Being sensitive to the fact that an older person's behaviour may be related to trauma and in some cases PTSD. Showing validation. Believe what the older survivor says to you about their experiences. Perpetrators often tell a victim they won't be believed. Research has found older victim survivors often take longer to tell their story. It's not a linear process. Disclosures can take place months after building trust with a practitioner. It's also important to be led by the language of the older person, using the words that they use to describe their experiences, and reflect this in your responses. Space. Strive to create a sense of safety in your work, considering physical settings, accessibility, and how staff and survivors interact with each other. Being open and honest. Be transparent in any decision making with survivors. Building trust is crucial for somebody who has experienced trauma and may take longer with an older survivor. Check that the older person fully understands the roles and remits of practitioners and organisations, and set realistic expectations. For example, ensuring an older victim survivor fully understands a criminal process and the potential outcomes that can help minimise re-traumatising experiences if they don't get the outcome that they've hoped for. Control and choice. Take a collaborative approach to the work of supporting the older survivor, working with them and others to support their decision making, rather than telling them what to do. Respect the choices of older survivors, whatever they may be. Be flexible in your approach and revisit options throughout your engagement. Encourage and support older survivors to consider what healthy relationships could look like for them and where they might be found, with professionals, friends, family, or in the community. Pace. Give regular breaks. People who are traumatised may have difficulty concentrating on topics for long periods of time or have difficulty retaining information. Using a strengths-based approach. Empower older survivors by reminding them of their strengths, focusing on achievements, and framing their experiences using language that focuses on recovery and healing. And ongoing support. Signpost and refer older victim survivors to specialist mental health support to address the impact of abuse. Recovery support is often not a consideration for older victim survivors, leaving psychological impact unaddressed and increasing vulnerability to further abuse. This slide demonstrates some tips on managing conversations with older victims of domestic abuse. Practitioners should be mindful that the barriers older victims face and the effects of trauma can make it hard to disclose, and that older victims may take time to build trust. Be wary of responses that close engagement. For example, call us back when you're ready to leave. Ensure questions and responses validate the older victims' experiences. Challenge self-blame. Seek to find out what the older person doesn't want as well as what they do want, and promote choice. It's important that the older victim is made fully aware of their options and the support available. They may not be ready to take action, but should be assured that they can take their time and change their mind. When and how to refer. If you are concerned an older person is at immediate risk of serious harm, you should call 999. Always advise an older person to call 999 first, rather than attempt to call you, if they are fearful for their own safety. They may only have the opportunity to make one call. 999 relay service is available for individuals who are deaf, hearing or speech impaired. For details of how to register and use the service, see this link. To report concerns that an older adult is being abused or is at risk of abuse, you should follow local adult safeguarding processes, and within Pennine Care, you can contact us in the safeguarding team to discuss any concerns. Domestic abuse organisations offer free, confidential advice and support for domestic abuse, including safety planning, legal rights and how to access emergency accommodation. An older person can call themselves or anyone can call for advice on their behalf. The Domestic Abuse, Stalking and Honour-Based Violence Risk Identification Checklist, commonly referred to as DASH or DASH-RIC, is a risk assessment tool and was developed to assess the risk to victims of domestic abuse, of serious harm or homicide. The DASH was developed primarily on research into younger female victims of abuse aged below 60, experiencing abuse from a male intimate or ex-intimate partner. There has been criticism that the DASH does not adequately capture risks experienced by older victims or males, people who are LGBTQ+, and victims of abuse from adult family members. The DASH consists of 24 questions which provide a score of standard, medium or high risk being a score of 14. Victims scoring 14 or above should automatically be referred to the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, commonly known as MARAC, and be offered support from an independent domestic violence advisor, or IDVA. The DASH can also be used for referral into MARAC under professional judgment. It includes a section where practitioners can add information that is not identified through the checklist, and this allows a practitioner to override a standard or medium score and make a decision to refer as high risk based on the practitioner's professional judgment. If a professional has serious concern about a victim's situation, they should refer the case to MARAC. There will be occasions where the particular context of a case gives rise to serious concerns, even if the victim has been unable to disclose the information that might highlight their risk more clearly. This could reflect extreme levels of fear, cultural barriers to disclosure, immigration issues or language barriers, particularly in cases of so-called honour-based violence. This judgment would be based on the professional's experience and or the victim's perception of their risk, even if they do not meet the checklist criteria. The DASH is not always used with older victims, and when it is not always used effectively, particularly when there have been long relationship and incidents of abuse have happened over a prolonged period, and when the abuse is from a family member. IDVAs who work with older victims have reported using a more conversational style when using the DASH has been more effective than just asking the questions. For those using the DASH, it is crucial to ensure victims fully understand what they are being asked. This slide explores 4 questions on the DASH-RIC to highlight some key considerations and skills when assessing risks with older victims. Question 3, what are you afraid of? Is it further injury or violence? Please give an indication of what you think the abuser might do and to whom, including children. In answer to this question, older victims will share many of the same fears with younger victims, including fear of injury to themselves and to others by the perpetrator. Older victims may be more fearful that their ability to safeguard themselves from injury is reduced and their likelihood of serious injury is increased due to increased frailty caused by health conditions or disability. For example, being pushed over may result in broken bones. Injury sustained where there is an existing condition, such as arthritis, may lead to temporary or permanent loss of mobility. And injury may increase dependency on a perpetrator and reduce ability to take action to keep themselves safe. It's important to ask if the older victim is afraid for anyone else. For example, violence or threat of violence towards the older victim's intimate partner from an adult family member, particularly if the intimate partner has health needs and is perceived as particularly vulnerable. In cases where there's more than one victim identified, for example, an older couple where the perpetrator is an adult grandchild, the risk to each victim should be assessed individually. Violence or threat of violence towards other family members residing or visiting the property, for example, an adult child threatening their sibling. And violence or threats of violence towards pets. Even when there's been no direct threat, the victim may be fearful of the consequences for their pets if they attempt to leave and can't take them with them. This may prevent them from disclosing the full extent of abuse. Question 4. Do you feel isolated from friends or family? Isolation can be harder to establish for older victims. Ageist assumptions that it's normal for social networks to reduce and levels of isolation to increase for older people can disguise the deliberate behaviour of a perpetrator to isolate an older victim. Ask the victim, does the perpetrator refuse to allow visitors to the house or make visitors feel uncomfortable? Does the perpetrator deny or restrict the older victims access to family, friends, community and services that are beneficial to them? In a long relationship, has the perpetrator always prevented the older victim from maintaining contact with family and friends or forming new friendships? Is the older victim dependent on the perpetrator to access services, for example, for transport to health appointments? And does the perpetrator accompany the older victim in all of their interactions with others? Question 10 and question 11. Is the abuse happening more often? Is it getting worse? In a long-term intimate relationship where abuse has fluctuated at different points in time, it can be difficult for the older victim to identify points of escalation. For example, there may have been physical or sexual violence early in the relationship, followed by a long period of coercive control with a reduction in physical violence, and the threat or use of physical violence has now recurred. Signs of escalation in later life should be taken seriously. Discussion about increased fear at questions 2 and 3 can be expanded upon to explore recent escalation. It's also useful to gain understanding of the history of the relationship and identify past points of escalation. Consider, what was the perpetrator's behaviour like at the beginning of the relationship? At what points has the abuse escalated? For example, when children have left home, when the perpetrator has become unemployed, or the victim's attempted to gain independence. What has changed recently? Has the perpetrator or victim retired? Are they spending more time together? Does the perpetrator or victim have increased needs for care and support, deteriorating health, or diagnosis of terminal illness? Has the escalation coincided with a reduction in the victim's support networks? For example, the loss of a close friend or family member whose support provided a protective factor. Escalation in abuse perpetrated by adult family members can indicate a shift in the power dynamic in the relationship. For example, the victim has increased dependency on family members for care and support, or the victim has moved into the home of an adult family member, or family members have moved into the home of the victim. The statutory response for local authorities to safeguarding adults in England is defined in the Care Act of 2014. Care Act guidance states local authorities should act to prevent harm and abuse, provide information and support to help people understand abuse and how to raise safeguarding concerns, raise public awareness, and act to prevent, stop, reduce abuse, harm and neglect to adults at risk. It defines the categories of abuse, of which domestic abuse is one. Adult safeguarding duty is met when an adult has needs for care and support, whether or not the authority is meeting any of those needs. The adult is experiencing or is at risk of abuse or neglect. And thirdly, as a result of those needs, is unable to protect themselves against the abuse or neglect or the risk of it. The local authority must make, or cause to be made, whatever inquiries it thinks necessary to enable it to decide whether any action should be taken in the adult's case. If adults do not fit the 3 statutory criteria outlined in Section 42 of the Care Act, local authorities are not required by law to carry out inquiries for these individuals, but they may do so at their own discretion. Support can also be carried out under the Care Act wellbeing duty. These inquiries would relate to an adult who is believed to be experiencing or at risk of abuse or neglect, does not have care and support needs, but might have just support needs, and is able to protect themselves. These inquiries might be about a carer, for example, or others at risk. Domestic abuse cases can be managed under multi-agency risk frameworks, for example, MARAC or MARM, or other existing MDTs, where adult health and care have a role. Doris Choice research has found that there can be confusion over whether it's appropriate for a safeguarding route or a domestic abuse route, and often an automatic assumption that it's safeguarding because it's an older person. There have been situations where abuse has not been clearly identified as domestic abuse, particularly when it's an adult child. Domestic abuse risk assessments have not been undertaken, so there is low visibility of these groups at MARAC. Or practitioners have viewed the situation as an adult safeguarding issue only, not for domestic abuse services. The benefits of multi-agency work are not always considered. Domestic abuse practitioners can assist social workers and other workers who are undertaking safeguarding work by working with victim survivors at the information gathering stage and in proactively responding to domestic abuse. For example, identifying abusive behaviours, exploring coercion, gaining a history of the relationship, risk assessment and support through criminal and legal processes also. Social workers can support domestic abuse practitioners with complexities around care needs, disability, health needs and issues around mental capacity, as can mental health practitioners. There is value in involving domestic abuse practitioners in safeguarding meetings right at the start so that they can build a relationship rather than signposting later. Doris Choice cases have shown the benefits of this through improved information gathering, understanding of what will and will not work in safety planning and action plans. Domestic abuse practitioners have often continued to work for a period after the safeguarding process has ended, providing support in recovery. This has also included clients contacting a domestic abuse service they've built a relationship with to report any further abuse, enabling a fast referral back into statutory safeguarding if necessary. This brings us to the end of the presentation, and the last two slides show some helpline information and some further resources here from Doris Choice relating to domestic abuse and older victims. Please do contact us in the safeguarding team at Pennine Care if there's anything that you would like to discuss, or if there's anything further in terms of advice that we can offer.